Hello, and welcome to Full Scottish. I'm your host, Seán Pieper, and I'm joined this Sunday by Martin Docherty-Hughes, MP for West Dunbartonshire, and the SNP's current shadow defence spokesperson at Westminster, and also by Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp, who is the founder of the Believe in Scotland campaign, which brings together yes groups from across Scotland. He's also the CEO of Business for Scotland, chief economist of the Scotianomics Wellbeing Economy think tank, and the author of Scotland the Brief. So welcome both of you to the programme.
Thanks for having us.
Now, we begin with a brief update on the conflict in Ukraine, which is currently on its 781st day. Germany has announced that it will supply US-made Patriot air defence systems and missiles to Ukraine at what it describes as, quote, a critical time, as Kyiv struggles to defend its energy sector from Russian bombardment. On Saturday, President Zelensky said that he was grateful to Germany's Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, for the decision to supply an additional Patriot system and missiles for existing air defence systems. Later, in his nightly video address, Zelensky indicated talks were underway on expanding the transfer of another air defence system, although German officials did not reference this in their statement. In response to the announcement, Olaf Scholz said on X, quote, "We stand steadfast on the side of Ukraine," adding that Zelensky had informed him in a telephone call on Saturday about, quote, massive Russian air attacks on civilian energy infrastructure. Germany's ambassador to Ukraine, Martin Jaeger, called on other international partners to quickly follow suit via social media. However, in the US, the House of Representatives has made a change to its schedule to consider legislation that supports Israel. House Majority Leader Stephen Scalise has said in a statement on Saturday that it's yet unclear whether he was referring to a standalone bill of aid to Israel or, in fact, the $95 billion supplement spending bill, which includes $14 billion for Israel, in addition to $60 billion for Ukraine and other humanitarian assistance. This larger package had passed the Senate with 70% support in February, however has been blocked in the House of Representatives by the Republicans. On Saturday, Colonel General Alexander Syrskyi, Ukraine's army chief, said that the situation on the eastern front of the conflict had worsened in recent days, as Russia has intensified its armoured assaults and battles rage for control of villages to the west of the devastated city of Bakhmut. Russia's defence ministry has announced that its troops have seized the village of Pervomayske in the Donetsk region, about 11 kilometres west of Avdiivka, the town captured by Russia in mid-February. Ukraine did not confirm this, however its general staff said on Saturday evening that troops had repelled Russian attacks on Pervomayske and other villages nearby. Ukrainian prosecutors said that Russia had launched airstrikes on villages across the Donetsk region on Saturday, leading to 3 deaths. Ukrainian authorities in Zaporizhia said Russia had struck the region more than 400 times in the past day, including from planes. Russia said that 1 man was killed by Ukrainian shelling, meanwhile, in the Russian-occupied town of Oleshki in the southern Kherson region. Safety at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant remains precarious. However, the shift to a cold shutdown of all 6 reactor units, which was completed on Saturday, is a positive, according to Rafael Grossi, the UN International Atomic Energy Agency chief, who said this in a statement. And finally, on Saturday, the London Metal Exchange banned all Russian metals produced on or after the 13th of April from its system to comply with new US and UK sanctions imposed following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, from Ukraine, we turn to what is clearly the sort of most pressing story, which is reflecting on the Iranian strikes on Israel, which happened last night. A combined strike of Shahed drones and cruise missiles. This is a clear first step of an escalation, not necessarily to war, but this is a new boundary broken. Iran has never directly struck Israel before, although the same cannot be necessarily said of Israel striking Iranian targets, though this is never publicly acknowledged. However, this adds to the fear, this adds to the tension, particularly the risk that the Israeli government will encourage and push the US into retaliating now for this strike when it's clear that Iran wants to see this as an end to the ratcheting of tensions created or further added to by the strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus on the 1st of April. However, the risk of real escalation and that spiraling further is still very much there. Martin, I'd like to start with you. How much of a risk of greater warfare is there in this moment, and what do you see as being potentially means to actually sort of contain this, or at least to allow calmer heads to prevail?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real risk of escalation. I think, as you mentioned, the Israeli attack on the Iranian consul in Damascus back in April, on the 1st of April, I think, was a clear indication about the possibility of retaliation from Iran. I think that also opened up a range of issues which Israel is now going to have to face, and that is they have exposed a lot of their missile sites and how they deal with incoming drone warfare. And as you mentioned, they should have drones, which the Russian Federation is using, of course, against the Ukrainian people. So there's a whole range of issues here, very complex. There's one easy answer to this, and it's the President of the United States phoning up the Prime Minister of Israel and telling them to put a stop to it. And people actually having to get down and talking about how we resolve the situation in Gaza and in the West Bank. And, Iran is pushing Israel here. I think they've exposed some weaknesses in Israel in terms of their military capability. And yeah, I mean, I think the hope now is that we can try and see some kind of stepping back. But who knows what Benjamin Netanyahu will do to try and remain in power in Israel. And just maybe a last point is, I think also the regime in Tehran also have their own complex problems. Iran is not necessarily as solidly behind the present regime as many people think. So, the distraction of bombing another country might help them in the short term, but in the long term, they're going through profound demographic change as well as any other country in the world. And it's very complex, and they all just need to step back from the edge.
Well, as you say, it's not just a case of the Israeli government being unpopular. The Iranian government is also unpopular. The actions of the American government are increasingly unpopular in this situation, and I think there's a real risk that we end up in a situation where we have greater conflict that nobody actually wants strategically, other than perhaps Benjamin Netanyahu, so that he's able to stay in power for a little bit longer. But I think this, I think sort of observing both how the conflict in Gaza is developing, how the conflict in Ukraine has developed, sort of the lessons that are being learned from this. It's hard not to see these as sort of bellwethers of the future of conflict in the 21st century.
Just to say, I mean, I think, and we'll probably come on to talk about Trident and shortly, but I think anyone who thinks that, we're not moving into a very different military future where, Ukraine doesn't need Britain, for example, to build nuclear weapons. It needs military support via ammunition and planes. It doesn't need new nuclear weapons sitting on the Clyde 10 miles from my front door. So, it's the exact same situation we're seeing between Iran and Israel, is that Iran is now utilizing what Russia has learned in Ukraine and its offensive against the people of Ukraine, and now pushing, the Israelis to the brink. And there is, a option for the President of the United States to turn around and say to Benjamin Netanyahu, enough.
Well, as you say, there are certain of these approaches to conflict are looking increasingly outdated, and that's on all sides, whether it's an insistence that, a nuclear deterrent is going to help actually suppress a conventional war happening halfway around the world, which it clearly is not, but also on the Russian side, we saw really retrograde Soviet-era tactics being used in the early period of the invasion, and actually how utterly disastrous that was when small groups of fighters armed with portable weaponry are able to completely snare up, 100-strong tank battalion. But anyway, as you said, let's move on to the issue of Trident. This week... Oh yes, sorry, Gordon, is there anything you'd like to add just in regards to the situation in Gaza or the sort of the potential of escalating conflict?
Well, all my life there's been trouble in the Middle East, and I don't see that changing. There doesn't seem to be, from my point of view, any international player who is even remotely interested in peace in the Middle East. They all have their own motivations for this. So, I don't think there's going to be a solution. In terms of escalation, there's, I don't know, what is it, about 1,000 miles between Iran and Israel. It's very difficult without crossing other countries to actually put any boots on the ground, have a proper war, etc. So I think we're just going to see more of the same. But yeah, the drone attacks are an escalation. I think we're just going to see an awful lot more of that. What did worry me about this situation is watching the immediate launch of RAF, British RAF planes to actually help shoot down these drones. Now, whereas you could say from a humanitarian point of view that we should do that wherever we have the opportunity, if indeed we had a conventional force that was capable of doing that, and we don't. But it just seems as if there was an immediate knee-jerk reaction to that, which wasn't discussed in Parliament, which, Israel seems to have significantly better protection from the Western world than a lot of other players do, who maybe deserve it more. So that's a serious issue as far as I can see.
No, I think that's a very good point, and I would certainly draw the parallels between as you say, the sort of swift knee-jerk reaction to the events of last night, and also then the swift knee-jerk reaction to deploying the RAF to bomb Yemen as well. Again, as you say, without debate in Parliament, without any clear statement on an actual strategic goal. Joining in largely with American efforts, but with no clear idea of how that actually makes the UK any safer.
Well, I think the key issue here is that an independent Scotland would have a conventional force that would be focused on protecting the peace around the world, on aid missions and on peace missions. And as part of the UK, it's not about protecting peace, it's about projecting power and pretending we have more power than we actually have. And that's, for me, is the big defence change that independence will actually bring for Scottish people.
Thanks, Gordon. So I think this idea of projecting more power than potentially is actually there, I think that does lead quite nicely on to the issue of Trident as a nuclear deterrent. Obviously this week, Sir Keir Starmer was in Barrow-in-Furness making his sort of brave statements about pushing the button in the event of nuclear warfare. Obviously a decision he would perhaps not be so keen to make if this nuclear deterrent was stationed just down the road from his constituency. That's the point. Essentially, should, instead of a nuclear deterrent in an independent Scotland, presumably the aim would be to be increasing conventional military spending, or actually potentially to do quite a sort of root and stem rethink of how do you actually build a military force for the 21st century that is fit for purpose and is actually fit for what its primary missions are, which is, first of all, to defend Scotland and its sort of territories, and also, as you say, to be a force for peacekeeping and stability. Small but well trained and well equipped. Just quite like your sort of reactions to that and how that is potentially at odds with the sort of continued reliance on a sort of large scale nuclear deterrent. So if we can come to Martin, come to you with that first.
Yeah, I sat and listened to Sir Keir Starmer's, fistful support of the nuclear deterrent and also the nuclear program, because there's more than just the actual missiles attached to this entire system, and that's why it's utterly out of control as a budget. So if the British Labour Party thinks that it's going to come in and it's suddenly, it's saying it's not got a magic money tree, but it's finding, in excess, I think, between 7.9 and 29.8 billion of a black hole for the existing replacement programme, then, I'm just wondering how they're going to plug that if it's not making cuts to other Whitehall budgets. So that would mean that areas around housing, around health, social care, even the foreign affairs budget would all be cut to try and plug that black hole. And if the National Audit Office is saying that, it's quite bizarre that the Labour Party thinks that it can plug that black hole. The other issue, in terms of what it means for Scotland, I mean, that would be very clear. The Scottish National Party would be very much clear that this investment should be going into public services and also into our conventional forces. I mean, the UK made a promise, Labour and the Tories and the Lib Dems made a promise back in 2014 that we would see, I think, around about 12,500 members of the armed forces based in Scotland. And as of today, they're actually 25% below that actual promise made in 2014. So Scotland requires a robust, capable armed forces. After independence, I would hope any government which sits in Edinburgh would have a full military review about what our capabilities are. We have a huge exclusive economic zone in the North Atlantic heading into the north, and we have responsibilities to defend our country and to work with our close allies in defending our way of life. That is not about, as Gordon was, I think with yourself and Gordon were talking about, expressing power, as some post-colonial power. When you have an armed forces where members of the armed forces are having to go to food banks, I think the British Labour Party's priorities are wholly wrong. And Ukraine doesn't need as I said, new nuclear weapons on the Clyde. It needs ammunition and it needs planes and it needs them desperately to fight against the aggressive Russian Federation. And no amount of expenditure on Trident and its replacement program is going to assist in that in any shape or form.
Thank you. Well, as you say exactly, the Scotland's sort of seaborne economic area is utterly huge. Scotland has so much coastline. Scotland has islands. The question is also, I think, essentially in an independent Scotland, simply the defence needs will look different. I think prioritising those aspects of Scotland's sort of territorial integrity is something that I've sort of read a little bit on in regards to that is the idea of creating something along the lines of the US, sort of a militarized coast guard that would combine aspects of naval and air, but actually be very sort of small, maneuverable, well equipped, and fit for purpose to actually address the sort of geography of Scotland itself. But so you have that kind of what does Scotland need on the one hand, but equally there's also surely a strong business case for this as well. Having a domestic defence force that has boats produced here in Scotland potentially that is equipped by Scottish companies. That is surely another string of resilience for an independent economy. So if I could put you to that to you, Gordon.
Well, on that particular point, yeah, I mean, I think there's been an awful lot of lessons learned recently about bringing shipbuilding back to the Clyde, for instance. So maybe those lessons could be applied to building coastal defence ships. We would require a coast guard, we would require our own navy, and most of those vessels, or a large number of them, would inherit some from the United Kingdom in the negotiations, obviously, for an independent Scotland. But we could actually build those ships on the Clyde, and as I say, apply what lessons have been learned recently to that. But for me, the key thing that has come out this week about on defence is Keir Starmer's I would press the nuclear button statement, which is nothing more than the usual right-wing posing of Labour that they have been doing for Tory voters or dissatisfied Tory voters in England. So basically, we're seeing Keir Starmer on defence, on the NHS, which I know we're going to talk about in future, on the economy, signalling time and time again that the next Labour government, because it's very likely to be a next Labour government, is going to be the continuity government. They're going to continue with Tory policies, but just maybe put a nicer, more competent, friendly face on it. But of course, they're not nicer, they're not more competent, they're not friendly towards Scotland.
Absolutely. And as you say, the idea of sort of a continuity Tory government when the in terms of their rebrand post-Corbyn, they were very much putting the emphasis on, we need to be seen with the Union Jack, with veterans in suits. It is very much about the respectability politics of the UK. And I think Trident, to some degree, fits in with that. It fits in with also the idea of the UK still being an imperial power rather than a post-imperial power.
Indeed.
But there is also equally a difficulty in terms of, I suppose, the wider public coming to terms with that as well. The nuclear deterrent has always been associated with safety, with stability. There is a real question of whether now, nuclear weapons being located in Scotland does not actually make us safer. It puts us in far more danger as actually a target more than anything else. And also equally, you have to look at what sort of condition the deterrent itself is in. Obviously, we're now debating the huge renewables around that. But
maybe if I could just come in on that, Sean.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I held a what they call an adjournment debate in the British Parliament a couple of weeks ago. And it was on the very issue of the infrastructure in Faslane and Coolport. It's in the neighbourhood of my constituency near my hometown, and the infrastructure at Faslane, we are led to believe by reports, is in a very, very difficult situation. And that is part of that big black hole about how the Ministry of Defence is cannibalising, or should I say the nuclear infrastructure budget is cannibalising every other aspect of defence spend. And there are serious questions that the UK government, not only Tories, but Labour, refuse to answer. And I can't imagine that, as Gordon alluded to, being any different, whether it be the Conservative Unionist Party or the British Labour Party sitting in Downing Street. They are going to be extremely secretive, and they are not going to tell us, even the very basics about investment in those areas around health and safety, which are giving many people grave cause for concern in relation to the infrastructure and its mismanagement of Faslane and Coolport.
Absolutely. As you say, even just having the infrastructure but not managing or maintaining it well is in itself a danger. As they say in the United States, the Republicans will apply austerity to everything bar the army and the police. Here in the UK, the Tories have applied full austerity to the armed forces and the police as well, to the point where we are seeing all of these various issues. We've seen misfired tests, essentially, or failures to complete tests of the Trident deterrent. So that really does not bode well for either as power projection or as a sort of domestic defence. The question I would put to you, Gordon, is where do you think money is best invested or better invested in this? In the sort of in a future independent Scotland vis-a-vis defence?
With specific regards to defence, an independent Scotland will not have nuclear weapons. That is absolutely key. There is an argument as to how long the nuclear weapons from the UK will stay in Scotland. There will be discussions on that as part of the negotiations, but clearly Scotland will, as a nation, would not accept an unreasonable length of time other than possibly the transition period towards independence, where those weapons were actually based in Scotland. The idea that that nuclear weapons keep us safe, surely people have begun to realise that that just isn't the case. It makes you a target. And people say to me, "Well, would you rather use nuclear weapons? Would you rather fire the nuclear weapons or be occupied?" And it's like, well, I'd rather be part of the resistance to an occupying force than melt at 9,000 degrees. So it's a fairly obvious answer to me. So where are we going to spend the money that Scotland would save, even if we kept the defence budget that's allocated to Scotland currently, in GERS, etc. If we were to keep that, or maybe move it up to 2.5% or something like that, well, yeah, navy, ships, conventional arms, rapid reaction, peacekeeping forces and aid forces able to go to crises around the world, help dig people out of collapsed buildings, these sort of things, keep the peace. So you look at Ireland, you look at, I think we need more of a conventional force than Ireland does. Norway as well, projecting peace. That's what it's all about. And conventional weapons, because right now, other than, and I think Martin was alluding to this, other than the nuclear deterrent, as it were, all we have is a scaled down conventional force that isn't really capable of doing any job you'd actually ask it to do nowadays. So Scotland should have its own armed forces. It should be part of, I think, a conventional alliance with the rest of Europe. As far as NATO is concerned, well, for many, many years, people have thought the NATO umbrella is what protects us, and I can see why Baltic states are thinking that's still the case. But I have a huge amount of trouble trusting NATO when America might be about to re-elect Donald Trump, because NATO is America's military foreign policy alliance, and whether you want to be part of that or not, under certain government conditions in America, is a debate that we should be having quite openly in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I think what you say as well about strategic alliances is particularly relevant on the basis of the geostrategic position that Scotland occupies. As the North Sea ice retreats further, we're going to see increased shipping, increased gas and oil exploitation, most likely in the Arctic Ocean, and also just the increased flow of sea trade, which will both up the time it takes to ship anything from Western Europe to Far East Asia, but equally a lot of that shipping lane is utterly dominated by the Russian Arctic fleet, essentially. So there is a sort of a strategic concern in around that as well. Do you think that in future will make Scotland an appealing ally as well? If I can go to you first with that, Gordon, but also I'd like your thoughts on that as well, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Norway and Scotland, between them controlling access from Europe out to the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, Scotland is incredibly strategically, defensively important. Maritime forces in particular are going to be very important. And so, yeah, there's the idea that Norway, which is a NATO member, and Scotland, between them, not working together would be crazy. So yeah, essentially, I do see Scotland as having a lot more say and influence in world affairs with a small conventional force than it has with the United Kingdom having a nuclear force, because of course our values tend to be very different from the Westminster government's values, and they are not projecting our values on the world scene. And I think that's one of the key benefits of being an independent nation, is that we're not going to be involved in future illegal wars or backing regimes that are creating war crimes.
What do you think, Martin? Does that promise a sort of relatively positive integrated defence future for Scotland and Europe?
Well, it really needs to be up to an independent government to set the agenda as to what Scotland's defence structure is going to look like. And I share some of what Gordon would like to see, kind of increased investment in our naval capacity, not just in, say, Coast Guard material, but actual naval capacity in the North Atlantic, critically working along with people like Norway. I have to say, I'd also like to see a close working relationship with what remains of the United Kingdom. We will share a land border. We will have mutual interests in the North Atlantic. I've often called for, is to have a robust defence agreement with the European Union. That would be the exact same once we leave the UK. But when it comes to issues around, NATO, of course, Norway has been a signatory to the NATO Washington Treaty since 1949. It's a non-nuclear power, as the vast majority of NATO members are. But we must also be mindful that the European Union has a far more robust defence clause in the Lisbon Treaty, and it's 42.7, Article 42.7 around mutual defence. And everyone keeps forgetting about the Lisbon Treaty and how it's actually far more robust than Article 5 of NATO. And as to the point about the possibility of Donald Trump's reappearance, I think that is sending grave concerns around the capitals of Europe. And we just cannot get away from the reality that the United States is the big player in NATO because it spends the most money. Now, on the other side, that really has now pushed the European Union and its NATO members to now increase spend in defence. But that really needs to be based on capability. What do you need to defend your country from an aggressor, say, for instance, the Russian Federation, or, the kind of, drone warfare or online warfare, dark money, etc., how it's all interlinked. And, come back to the place that you do not do that by spending money on Trident. You work closely with key allies, and, Gordon mentioned Ireland. I would maybe mention Denmark. Denmark is a country which, like Scotland, has a very proud martial history. And in Denmark, you will find that they don't have a recruitment and retention problem in the regular armed forces. They actually find it problematic to get people to leave. And they don't have members of the armed forces going to food banks. And neither do they have members of the armed forces having to rely on charities to give them good public service, because they have a system of government, a social democratic model, which provides good public services for every citizen, no matter what their role in that society is. And that's the kind of format I would hope that Scotland look at. We're not Ireland. We have a huge exclusive economic zone. We have massive natural mineral wealth, and we have a very long martial history, and that will certainly play a picture in how Scotland redefines its position as a defence structure in the North Atlantic. And maybe just finally say that I think it's important that what negotiations take place, we don't just say, accept what the remainder of the UK wants us to take, because a lot of their procurement processes have been very dubious, and we really need to be clear that anything that we're going to spend money on fits our purpose and not the old UK structure. And that really does lead into investing in our own national defence structure. I think that would be critically important after defence. We don't take the UK's leftovers. We critically invest in good military capability for the defence of our country in the 21st century.
Well, exactly. As you said, it's about having an actual cohesive, funded and realistic approach that is actually tailored to your needs, rather than a sort of a scattergun power projection approach. For example, the situation that the UK is in with its aircraft carriers, for example, where it has spent huge amounts of money on them, it can't effectively deploy them, and we're left with a sort of a status symbol that is not really of much function to anybody. But these are, very much the issues that would be at the forefront of a sort of an independent Scotland's defence policy, presumably. Now, let's move on from defence to the NHS, specifically the potential of NHS privatisation. Now, this week, Wes Streeting has defended his plans for the next government, or the next Labour government rather, to involve more private healthcare companies within the NHS in England and Wales. However, due to Barnett consequentials, this has inevitable implications for the allocation of funding for Scotland's NHS as well. So, if I could come to you first, Gordon, in regards to that, what are the risks if England and Wales's NHS becomes increasingly privatised while Scotland's is still sort of attempting to maintain some degree of balance where it is now?
Yeah, so there is genuinely a funding risk, but as a bit of background before going on to that, I would say that an incoming Labour government absolutely has no choice. It has to increase privatisation in the NHS. That's not because of budgets, that's because they do not want to roll back Brexit. And if they don't want to roll back Brexit, they will be desperate for a trading relationship with the United States. And the United States is not going to agree, a future Trump government, if that's what we're faced with, is not going to agree to do a trade deal with the UK, giving Labour an early trade win, unless its private healthcare companies get full access to the NHS. So Labour, by projecting their right-wing Thatcherite credentials and refusing to roll back on the problems of Brexit and the terrible deal that the UK has got, are now locked into a situation where they have to privatise. And again, in an independent Scotland, we have different values. Our values are that it should be a public service and free at the point of need. And so basically, that is going to happen. There will be increasing privatisation no matter who wins this next election. How does that impact on the budget? Well, you could actually, there will be an argument around this in terms of if you bring in private healthcare, and more of the services actually have to be paid for by individuals or by insurance firms, etc., then as part of the UK, if Scotland does not follow the same model, and we wouldn't, because the NHS is not just evolved, it's always been run independently in Scotland. If we don't follow that same model, then the actual UK budget for healthcare will drop. That doesn't mean that it'll be more efficient service or it'll cost less to deliver the NHS in England. It won't. It will be less efficient. It will cost a hell of a lot more. But the actual public sector budget may reduce, and that will reduce the block of grant to Scotland. So it's a completely and utterly unworkable situation, as far as I'm concerned. We're heading down that route. Labour are not an alternative. People say this election's about getting rid of the Tories. Well, the answer is blue Tories or red Tories. We're talking about changing the colour of the door and absolutely nothing else. And healthcare is one of the big issues, but that message just isn't getting across because we're not talking about the SNP, which is the party, the only party, pro-independence party in Scotland that can actually win seats in this election. That's not me favouring the SNP, that's me saying something about mathematics of the situation. They're just not talking enough about independence and not actually sharing what their vision for the NHS would be in an independent Scotland. And therefore, people are thinking, oh, well, at least some change is coming, so let's vote Labour.
Well, that's exactly a problem, this idea of just change is good regardless of what kind of change, when actually the implications are not really being openly discussed or analysed. Another issue in relation to the sort of the influence of private healthcare in the NHS is also the suggestion that Wes Streeting himself might have received up to £175,000 in donations from private healthcare firms, and then proceeding to, forcefully argue the case for their influence within the NHS. I don't think that's a unique situation with regards either UK politics or the Labour Party, certainly not the Tory Party. Martin, how would you reflect on, I would say, the influence of lobbying, of donations in relation to really kind of core issues like this?
Well, lobbying is endemic in the British Parliament. Let's not kid ourselves on. And, the question is who's getting that money, whether it's the Labour Party and Wes Streeting taking it from private healthcare companies, or it's Tories in the House of Lords taking dark money from the Russian Federation. this is the Westminster system. It's how they work, and I'm afraid that without more robust, oversight by the Electoral Commission, which I don't see coming in any shape or form, that this will continue. And of course, I think Gord made a very important point around Brexit and trade deals with the United States and how that's not happening at the moment. And so it's not even just Donald Trump who would want access to the NHS structures. Joe Biden's very clear. Those of us on the left who might think that Joe Biden, is some kind of left-wing Democrat, he's holding back for a range of reasons on a trade deal with the UK, and one of those will be access to the NHS market, what he would classify as the NHS market. So, we need to be very clear in Scotland that, this is a clear threat to a public healthcare provision in our country. And come the election campaign, we need to be very clear about how Brexit is impacting our ability to deliver a robust healthcare model based on free at the point of delivery, and which excludes private healthcare. That we need to challenge many of the existing structures which we've inherited from the Westminster system in our health structure. Most of our GPs are all actually private contractors. We need to give full consideration as to, is that model, as a social democrat, I do find that slightly problematic. So, we really need to be clear about, when the general election comes, about what our offer is to the people of Scotland, and also be speaking up very robustly about how different our NHS structure is in Scotland. And I take the example during the pandemic, and slightly go back to the MOD system. In England and Wales, you found the army building emergency hospitals, many of them without toilets or running water. You found the army not only building them, but designing them, doing the logistics. Now, in Scotland, we didn't need the armed forces to do that, because in Scotland didn't privatise NHS procurement as they did in England and Wales. So, it's that type of infrastructure that we still have in Scotland, which should be the bedrock of a publicly delivered, free at the point of delivery NHS, not only as part of the union, but also after independence.
Absolutely. For a service like the NHS, capacity is utterly key. And during COVID, the NHS in Scotland was able to do a range of things that were not so quickly on the table in England, also in terms of doing in-house testing, for example. I believe that.
Yeah, I mean, we also need to be. Yeah, I mean, we also need to be mindful that there are no strikes in the NHS in Scotland. There were very robust negotiations with trade unions around pay, as there should always be, and we have not seen the impact of what is happening in the health structure, not only in England but in Wales as well, where the Labour Party, of course, is in administration. So we have a lot to be talking about, which is positive. It's never perfect. Nothing's ever perfect. But we need to be very robust in defending what we've been able to achieve with the limited amount of resources that we get from Whitehall.
Turning back to you, Gordon, what would you estimate actually the impact of Brexit thus far has been on, I'd say, both the NHS in England and Wales, because clearly their issues are impacting on Scotland, regardless of policy differences, but also here in Scotland, I can imagine it would impact staff retention or acquiring new staff, but I'm sure there are sort of myriad ways in which it has eroded the ability for the NHS to sort of function as well as it could be.
Yeah, it's not just the NHS, but care services as well. Without high levels of immigration, then the NHS and care homes cease to function. And that is something that Brexit has negatively impacted on. There used to be a decade ago, it was people from the Baltic states and Eastern European states that worked in care homes. Now it's from the Commonwealth. I'm going on personal experience of visiting family. There has been a significant change in that. So if what Brexit has done is it has signalled to the world that the United Kingdom isn't interested in being internationally friendly, it isn't interested in having open trade, it isn't interested in positive immigration to the country, which we need. And even though that signal's been sent out there, and there have been sectors across industry, such as transport, etc., running out of Polish drivers, etc. When it comes to the immigration levels are actually up, but it's so it's not worked. It's just negative. Can you have a negative virtue? It's just negative virtue signalling. There's no effective plan to change immigration. But we don't want to, because in Scotland we are now projected to have a shrinking economy, a shrinking population again. We need 10,000 IT programmers, for instance, and a lot of them would work in government and public services and the NHS, etc. And we just don't produce enough people to actually meet those skills needs. So essentially, the message an independent Scotland would send is that if you want to come here, work, live in Scotland, raise your family in Scotland, and contribute to our economy, contribute to our health and care services, then you are welcome to do so. And that would be a really positive message that an independent Scotland could put out. But I noticed that even in Scotland, immigration is considered to be one of the key issues in this next election. But we don't know what people are thinking about that, and we don't know. You can say that people in the southeast of England think immigration is the boats, etc. Is it because we've got a UK-wide media putting that to us again and again, that negative message about immigration, and therefore the people of Scotland are allowing that to sink in, even though we as a nation have radically different immigration needs? Think of farmers, think of fruit pickers, etc. Think of the slaughterhouse vets being mostly Polish and deciding to go home, damaging our food industry, etc. Scotland needs positive immigration, and I think we have to have an open conversation about what that means. For me personally, I would say also in independent Scotland, one of the first things it should do is have a homecoming plan to try and get as many Scots and Scots families that were actually forced out for economic reasons, as mine were, had to move to England for economic reasons in the 80s. I would like to see a booming Scottish economy invite as many of them back as we possibly can as well.
Very interesting prospect. Now, the figure you were referring to in regards to Scottish electorate and focus on immigration, that comes from this Redfield and Wilton poll, which has showed that in terms of the priorities for this upcoming general election in relation to the Scottish electorate, by far the highest were the economy on 58% and the NHS on 54%. So actually there is a real potential for cut through with regards to the threat of privatisation facing the NHS in England and the knock-on effect on funding here. But as you say, immigration features, education, housing, and in this polling, this is the lowest polling on 15% for people putting Scottish independence as the priority for this election. Now, again, as you said, having immigration as a concern might mean something very different in the south of England versus here. But I think this also potentially points to what we were, or what you rather were talking about a little bit earlier, Gordon, the idea of the why of independence versus the process of independence. Are the 15% putting it as their top priority? Is that people who are looking for a referendum out of this election? Versus actually people who are concerned about the economy or the NHS might be just as concerned or engaged with independence, but actually what they see is that the sort of the offer on the table right now is about, do you have essentially Labour, wipe the map, or do you actually have a sort of strong Scottish opposition as well coming from the SNP? So, Gordon, if you could kind of elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts with regards to the importance of the why versus the process.
Well, first of all, looking at that particular issue, the company Redfield and Wilton Strategies actually polled and came up with 20 categories of what are the most important issues. And yes, independence is at its lowest, only 15%, but it's also 7th out of 20, so it's still in there. But why is it 7 7th out of 20. It's not because independence is becoming irrelevant, it's because the Scottish Government isn't talking about independence enough. It's not promoting independence. So if you're a politician and you're looking at this and you think, oh, it's, the economy, the NHS, immigration, education, housing and the environment are all more important to people than independence, that doesn't tell you that they're not interested in independence. That tells you that you've not actually told people just how significant independence is to improving the economy, the NHS, immigration, education and housing and the environment, right? You're just not making the case for independence. And so, if you're looking at the SNP's potential situation they have with this 2024, we assume October 24 general election, they're currently looking as if they're going to lose 20 seats, 15 to 20 seats. It's going to be potentially worse than the 2017 reversal. And so if they're sitting at 32, 33% in the polls, but independence in the same poll is sitting at 51%, then clearly the analysis is you're not talking about independence enough. You're not going to motivate your own core vote if you say this is not about independence. It has to be an independence-led campaign. The SNP, if they want to save as many of their seats as possible and stop what is going to be a UK-wide Labour juggernaut at the border, thus protecting the independence movement from Labour politicians who will say that even winning a handful of seats is a statement of intent for the union, and they will use whatever power they've got to put independence back in its box. We can't allow that to happen. So fire up the independence vote is the message I would give to Hamza Yusuf and his team, and I would say make this about independence, but not about the process of independence. Let's talk about how the economy will be better with independence. Let's talk about how we will be the most advanced, most successful economy ever to regain its independence, and then talk about how we can bring in a well-being economy that won't leave people behind, that will allow growth in the economy, good growth in the economy, because it will be balanced with the environment. Let's talk about how independence will improve the NHS, how independence will improve education, how it will improve housing. Because for a long time now, the SNP have been saying things like, well, of course, I believe in independence, but the big issues are, no, tell people that independence will make a difference in their lives. Tell people how their hopes and aspirations and dreams for a better Scotland can be achieved through independence, when quite clearly that cannot be achieved by staying with the United Kingdom. And if you actually take a look, it's an open goal. If independence has a 10 or 12% lead on the SNP, then clearly the SNP aren't talking about independence enough. But let's take a look at some of those top issues in this poll. So what are the most important election issues to Scottish voters? The economy, NHS, etc. Okay, well, let's take a look at UK government policy improvement ratings. Well, the NHS is their least popular policy, in terms of competency. They've got the lowest approval ratings on NHS, the economy, housing, crime and policing and the environment. So actually, where the most important issues are the ones that the UK government is worse at, and Labour are telling you they're going to continue to do exactly the same things as the Tories are, but with, a pretendy social democratic approach, which just, if you look at their policies, isn't the case. So it's an open goal, and so far the SNP are refusing to shoot into that and take the significant mandate to move independence forward through a genuine independence convention. They've got to take that shot, and they've got to win for the sake of the movement, for the sake of Scotland.
What do you think, Martin? Would you like to respond to that or add anything onto that?
Yeah, but I'm not necessarily going to agree with everything that Gordon said with that. I mean, if we look at the Scottish Government's own Building a New Scotland, whole process of publishing papers around health, around all the topics you've been discussing, and how it's inextricably linked to independence, and why we require hope delivered through an independent sovereign Scotland to deliver on all the aspects that we've talked about, from education to health to social care, to delivering a better economy, renewables, meeting our net zero commitments, and building a stronger economic model. through those papers and through a lot of the things that the Scottish Government's been doing recently, and it's inextricably linked to why we need to be an independent country. The other thing I would say about these polls is I'm always interested as to how they ask the question. And if you were to ask all these people who we talked about the kind of what they see as their top items, and if you ask them, do you think independence would assist in delivering those issues and making them better for you? I'm sure that the people who believe in independence would say inextricably, yes, of course we believe independence would assist in providing and creating a better healthcare system, a stronger economy and a commitment to renewables and to net zero and to the economy. And, once this election campaign kicks off, because it's not there yet, he could hold out till January, I think you'll see a far more robust response when we actually get a lot more airtime, because that's one of the huge difficulties we have at the moment with the mainstream media sidelining what not just the Scottish Government, but also my parliamentary colleagues, both in Holyrood and Westminster, have to say. How often are we sidelined in terms of offering a different opportunity? But once the campaign gets up and going, I think we'll see a very different projection, not only from the party, not only from the Scottish Government, but from the party as well. And I'm looking forward to that and defending West Dunbartonshire for the fourth time. Of course, a yes voting constituency, and campaigning to not only keep it yes voting, but to hopefully return an MP who believes solidly in the right to national self-determination. And that campaign will be based, as the First Minister has said, for voting for a party that believes that only independence can deliver that hope and that type of future that we want for our country.
Well, best of luck with that. And finally, I would just like to add there is an event next Saturday, the 20th of April, here in Glasgow. This is being organised by Believe in Scotland. That's your organisation, Gordon. What can we expect from this? What's on the agenda?
Well, first of all, this isn't a political protest march. This is a celebration of Scotland's potential as an independent nation. As an organisation, we are focused on the grassroots. We have 142 local campaign groups who come together to campaign for independence. And we think that it's the grassroots that move the polls, that actually engage people, that talk to people about independence. And I would argue that there's so much grassroots activism going on across Scotland that it's that and not anything that the politicians are doing that's actually got independence sitting at 51% in this poll. And that, as I say, is the open goal that the SNP have to aim for. We've got more of a cultural focus. We want to make this about a celebration of Scotland's potential. We want to talk about how independence will make Scotland a better country, not talk about the processes, but all of our speakers, many of whom have never spoken at rallies before, we just wanted to bring other voices, cultural voices, into the mix as well. So we've got speakers from from cultural industries, but also from C&D and from trade union movement, etc. And instead of complaining, we are campaigning. The march and rally we did in Edinburgh last year was a great success. People said it felt like the 2014 Yes movement coming back together, and that's what we're trying to create. A real festival of independence, and it's part of our big independence weekend, where we will be doing the march and rally. We also have an after party to thank the hundreds of people that are volunteering. So if you haven't volunteered yet, volunteer, come along and get an invite to the after party, which will be a great fun opportunity as well. And then on the Sunday, the following day, we are working with all the local Yes groups, and people from any political party are happy to come, are welcome to come along and help us do a mass leaflet drop with multiple stands in the south side, starting at Langside Halls. So jump on social media, sign up, and listen out for the notifications of that, and the more the merrier from right across the movement. But I'm hoping it's going to be a success, but we're aiming for quality and entertainment and the fun atmosphere for this one. So it's a celebration of Scotland's potential, not a political protest.
Well, that sounds very exciting. Look forward to that. Yes, we'll be covering the events next weekend here on Broadcasting Scotland. And that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just would like to remind you that Broadcasting Scotland depends on the generosity of its supporters. Our programme will always be free. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and achieving regular funding. Thank you again to my guests, Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp and Martin Docherty-Hughes. And goodbye, and thank you for watching. Enjoy your Sunday.